The attack on Pearl Harbor. The moment the sleeping giant awoke. Date: December 7, 1941. Location: Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Oahu Island, Hawaii, USA. Belligerents: the Empire of Japan vs. the United States of America. Outcome: tactical victory for Japan. The official entry of the United States into World War II. This was not merely an aerial assault. It was a seismic jolt that altered the canon of world history. And that jolt awakened a sleeping giant. Phase of preparation. Japanese front. Strategic objective: the escape of a cornered empire. In the early 1940s, Japan was advancing with the ambition of building an empire across the Asia-Pacific. Its aggressive occupation policies in China and its expansionist drive towards Southeast Asia alarmed the Western powers. But instead of a direct military response, the West struck with economic force. The United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed an embargo on Japan, cutting off vital supplies like oil, rubber, iron, and steel. Japan's war machine was being starved of the very resources it needed to function. The embargo became a chokehold on Japan's military expansion. Without oil, the Japanese Navy was no more than a fleet without swords. Without steel, no tanks or aircraft could be built. There was only one solution: to seize resource-rich territories like the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. But first, the greatest obstacle on that path had to be removed: the U.S. Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor. The plan: a scream behind the silence, Operation Z. This was more than just a military operation. It was a gamble that placed the future of an entire nation on the line. The mastermind behind the plan was Admiral Yamamoto, a Harvard-educated strategist who understood the West intimately. He was fully aware of America's industrial and technological might. Yet he believed, Japan cannot win a prolonged war with the U.S., but with a decisive first strike, we might force them to negotiate. Thus was born, codename Operation Zia, the boldest move in Japanese naval history. Operational details: architect of the attack, Admiral Yamamoto. Total force: 06 aircraft carriers, 24 support vessels, 5 submarines. The strike force moved north in complete silence. Approaching from the Alaskan waters, away from radar and reconnaissance routes. Radio communications were kept to a minimum. Radio silence was absolute. Air power: total aircraft, 353, divided as follows: 183 planes. In the first wave, 170 in the second. Types of missions: bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, and reconnaissance timing. The assault was scheduled to begin at 07:42 a.m., December 7th, 1941. It was a Sunday morning. Most American personnel were either sleeping or on leave. Diplomatic deception. Delayed letters in the shadow of the attack. Japan had intended to deliver a diplomatic message shortly before the strike. A last-minute note to indicate that hostilities were imminent, thus avoiding the appearance of a surprise attack. But intentionally or not, the message was delayed. Japanese envoys in Washington failed to deliver the 14-part message in time. The United States received the note only minutes before the attack began. The result: the attack on Pearl Harbor was officially recorded as a sudden and treacherous assault. Yamamoto's gamble. This operation was meant to buy Japan time, but Yamamoto's inner voice never ceased. We are striking one of the enemy's eyes. But when both eyes open in fury, how long can we withstand the storm? Phase of preparation. American front. State of defense. Power beneath the silence, Pearl Harbor. a military fortress nestled along the shores of Oahu Island, in the heart of the Pacific. It was the headquarters of America's Pacific Fleet, but more than a show of force, this base represented the deterrent presence of the United States in the Asia-Pacific. Military presence at the base. 8 battleships were anchored in the harbor. Over 150 aircraft were lined up on the airstrips, including fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes. More than 20,000 military personnel were on routine duty. The fleet's flagships, USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and USS West Virginia, were stationed here. On the surface, everything seemed ready. But this readiness was for peace, not war. Neglect and misjudgment. The price of silence. Morning of the attack. December 7, 1941. The base awoke to what appeared to be a typical Sunday in paradise. Some soldiers read letters in their barracks. Others had breakfast in the mess hall, while a few strummed guitars by the beach. But at that very moment, a shadow was approaching from the north, and some did see it. Radar warning. At 7:02 a.m., radar operators north of Oahu detected a large formation of aircraft in the sky. The report was dismissed by senior officers, who assumed it was a squadron of American bombers on a training run. No alarm was raised. The belief, planes coming from that far must be ours, opened the door to disaster. Trust in diplomacy. Intelligence in Washington had already predicted that Japan was preparing for war. However, the expected targets were believed to be the Philippines, Thailand, or Malaya. Hawaii, isolated in the middle of the Pacific, was seen as outside the scope of any potential attack. That's why the soldiers at Pearl Harbor were not preparing for an ambush. They were preparing for a sunny morning. Conclusion: the United States had faith in its own power. But that confidence had turned into complacency. Pearl Harbor was armed to the teeth, yet mentally locked in peacetime, anticipating days without conflict. And the Japanese planes were about to tear through this illusion of peace. The course of the attack. December 7th, 1941. It was a Sunday morning. The sky was clear, the sea was calm, but shadows were gliding silently from above. 07:48 a.m. First wave, steel wings, that tore through the silence. At exactly 07:48 a.m., the skies over Oahu echoed with the roar of engines. The first wave of 353 Japanese aircraft painted the rising sun black. Their target, the heart of the Pacific Fleet, Pearl Harbor. The battleships lay still in the harbor, unaware, unalarmed. A single bomb struck the USS Arizona, hitting it dead center. The explosion was so massive that the ship split in two, sinking within minutes, taking 1,177 crew members to a watery grave. Simultaneously, bombers turned toward the airfields, targeting planes chained to the ground. Dozens of American aircraft, unable to take off, were reduced to fireballs on the tarmac. As Pearl Harbor burned, one truth became undeniable. America was unprepared. 8:40 a.m. Second wave, the finishing blow. The Japanese forces didn't retreat after the first blow. At 8:40 a.m., a second wave darkened the sky. This time, the targets had changed: fuel depots, hangars, and runway infrastructure. American anti-aircraft crews had awakened. A few pilots began returning fire, but the impact of the surprise still lingered, and American defenses were far from coordinated. This second wave didn't just scorch Pearl Harbor, it scarred the heart of the American people. We talked aftermath. Destruction beyond numbers. 8 battleships were damaged. 4 were sunk. The other 4 were eventually repaired after months of effort. 188 aircraft were completely destroyed, 159 others severely damaged. 2,403 American servicemen were killed, 1,178 wounded. Japanese losses were minimal in comparison: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 personnel. These numbers were more than statistics. They marked the beginning of an awakening. Pearl Harbor was no longer just a naval base. It became a symbol. The moment the sleeping giant awoke, strategic and psychological impacts. December 7, 1941, was not just another day. It was a turning point in human history, where steel, fire, and wills had collided. Strategic effects: the awakening of a sleeping giant. Only one day after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress with a historic speech. Within mere hours, the United States formally declared war on Japan. But this declaration was not limited to Japan alone. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States in return, and thus, the U.S. entered World War II with full force. The world had stepped onto a path with no return. America, once a neutral observer, was now transformed overnight into the military superpower that would shape the fate of the world. Japan's gain or its doom. At first, the outlook seemed bright for Japan. The Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Indonesia quickly fell under Japanese control. With its formidable navy, Japan established dominance in the Pacific. But the attack on Pearl Harbor ignited a spark, one that turned Japan's short-term victories into the seeds of long-term catastrophe. For now, Japan faced a unified American nation, mobilizing its full industrial might. And for an island empire, that was a threat of unimaginable scale. Psychological effects: the collapse of pride, the rise of unity. The American public was struck by a deep shock. Pearl Harbor was a dagger plunged into the heart of a nation believed to be invincible. But fear quickly turned to national fury. Roosevelt, from the steps of Congress, declared, "A date which will live in infamy." This sentence was not just a declaration of war. It was a nation rising to its feet. Mobilization begins. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Women took over factories, birthing the legend of Rosie the Riveter. Industrial production soared to unprecedented wartime levels. Posters, newspapers, and radios echoed a singular message: "Remember Pearl Harbor." This slogan did not fuel hatred. It fueled resolve and united a nation. The psychological explosion that followed Pearl Harbor shook not just America, but the entire Allied world. From that moment forward, the war was no longer just about territory. It was about honor, freedom, and vengeance, human and historical significance. Pearl Harbor was not merely a morning of sinking ships and burning aircraft. It was a catastrophe etched into the heart of a nation, echoing through eternity. Wounds, not of flesh, but of the soul. Thousands of soldiers who survived the attack carried that morning with them for the rest of their lives. Some kept hearing the explosions in their dreams. Some never forgot the screams of comrades struggling in the water. And others remained silent for years, burdened by the guilt of having survived. The veterans of Pearl Harbor became not just survivors of war, but living vessels of memory. They bore truths that no history book could fully capture, truths visible only in their eyes. USS Arizona, the silent tomb, the most iconic casualty of the assault. The USS Arizona. Struck by a single bomb, she exploded. Her hull was torn in half, and with 1,177 sailors, she was swallowed by the sea's darkness. To this day, the wreck of the Arizona lies beneath the waters of Oahu. Above her rests the USS Arizona Memorial, visited by thousands each year. Those who stand over the glass floor, peering into the depths, feel as though they're gazing upon the silent heroes entombed below. And the sea still slowly releases black tears, droplets of oil seeping to the surface, as if the ship itself whispers, "I haven't forgotten those I carry." A moment etched in blood and history, Pearl Harbor remains the single deadliest military blow ever struck on American soil in one day. This event didn't just alter the course of war, it transformed a nation's identity. A people who once said, "War cannot reach us," now stood ever vigilant. A world that once believed, "America watches," now declared, "America leads." And the word peace came to bear a heavier, more solemn meaning, shaped by the sacrifice of those who paid its price. The silence that speaks to this day, when December 7th dawns and the fallen of Pearl Harbor are remembered, a solemn silence takes hold. But that silence is not forgetfulness. It is the loudest voice of reverence, because Pearl Harbor was not merely an ambush. It was a scream drowned beneath the sea, echoing through history, the awakening of the giant. It was a morning, and the bombs fell, but they shattered more than steel. They tore through history itself. December 7th, 1941. The end of silence. As the sun rose, the skies over Hawaii were not blue. They echoed with the roar of engines, the thunder of guns, the black plumes of smoke. That morning, it wasn't just Pearl Harbor that awakened. The entire world stirred, and the American people knew nothing would ever be the same again. The giant awakens. A nation that had long chosen to remain on the sidelines of war would no longer stand aside. On that fateful morning, the United States didn't just declare war, it seized the reins of history. President Roosevelt's words echoed not just through Congress, but through the soul of all humanity. December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. The fire of vengeance and hope. Though the attack on Pearl Harbor may have seemed like a victory for Japan, it was, in truth, the spark of its undoing. For now, the slumbering giant was no longer at rest. It had risen, forged in fire, and fueled by resolve. America rose on every front. Its factories roared to life. Its youth rushed to battle. Its people stood united for freedom. From the beaches of Normandy to the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, from the streets of Berlin to the cliffs of Okinawa, the shadow of Pearl Harbor marched beside them all. Today, those who witnessed that morning are now few. But Pearl Harbor is not merely a memory. It remains a warning. The skies may be quiet. The seas may seem calm. Yet the scream of that morning still echoes through the corridors of time. You have awakened us, and now we shall defend the world.